the session just now. So once again, thank you very much, everybody. We picked up or we restarted the series. A few people mentioned that it'd be really, or they kind of missed it, and it'd be really good to start the conversations again. So, well, I don't know, I've maybe gone wrong somewhere with my timings or something like that. There's not many people. Usually we have a lot more than this turn up to the sessions. So we'll see how it goes. I just wanted to really quickly share with you some of the other events or the other dates that we've got. Oh, my apologies. So hopefully I'll share this. Oh, whoops. There we go. I'll share this online with everybody anyway, and you can see all the meeting details on the events page. So we've got a few, and there's a few people now kind of offering to do a few presentations. So the next one, it's going to be in Pacific time, unfortunately. So that's going to be really, really early in the morning for the States, from the people from the States. It will be recorded, so you can maybe catch up on it later. But that's going to be Kate Tregloan from the University of Melbourne. Now, their BELT framework is actually quite an interesting one. There's actually an article on the Distance Design Education blog, and that's partly a hybrid model between their architecture pedagogy and the kind of forced transition or the forced pivot to online education. So there's some nice sort of bits and pieces in that. So Kate's going to talk about that. It's not going to be a one-to-many sort of presentation as such. Kate's going to pick out some of the big lessons, I think, and maybe try to get a bit of a conversation going. The other thing is that the document for today, the shared document for today, I will put a link to that in the text chat in just a second, but please feel free to add to this if you want to live note to that. There isn't much of a plan, I think, to today. We're going to keep it quite open. Sorry, my apologies. I'm just trying to find the chat box because it goes all over the place in Teams. Sorry, that's a link to the Google Doc. So there's not much of a plan to today. It's relatively informal. It'd just be good to catch up with people in different places, different contexts, find out what everybody's been up to, what the big challenges have been, what the situation is, and then maybe a little bit of try to end on it. I know it's the old, was it a criticism sandwich? I use the pejorative term, which I can't repeat when I'm being recorded. If we end on something maybe a bit happier, if there's anything that's maybe giving people any kind of cause for optimism in this day and age, then by all means share it with us. Apart from that, I've got no other sort of plan for today, so please feel free to chip in or interrupt. I'd like to hear as many voices as possible. So yeah, and I don't think that'll be hard to today. Maybe start from sort of west to east, maybe going round the time zone. So I think the earliest might be, is anybody from the States? Ken? No, you're in Europe just now, aren't you? Yep. So anybody who wants to admit to being the furthest west, we might actually be challenging here. Okay, cool. What about Yolanda? You're the furthest south. I know that. You muted?
Yolanda, muted.
I'm sorry, I'm muted in two places, and this is a funny thing. Hard to still after years to get it right, to not be muted. Yeah, we just as feedback, I think we're in the same kind of blob of time, just way too busy, and we've kind of figured out it's because we don't just get ourselves displaced from one space, physical space, to another. So the day is just continuous, and it's mostly online. Our students are returning to campus, but they largely very fearful, worried. So we're finding similar to what you've been finding, I think, Derek, at the Open University, that everybody was resisting online learning and design related education. And now all of a sudden, there are people who don't want to go back to the face-to-face situation. So we actually, ironically, the blended program that I'm teaching on, we've got a week of contact in November, but today we decided that even that contact time will be optional, so that we use the contact for those students who want additional support that's face-to-face. Of course, those students who can or are based near to Cape Town, but that we don't get students to travel all the way to campus and then finding that you know, in November, we don't know whether we may have a second wave. At the moment, things are looking up, but I think to design for the worst case scenario and then just use contact as a nice to have currently is our kind of mode. Yeah, go to mode.
So in that, Yolanda, is there anything that's surprised you, or is kind of giving you a bit of hope, or has there been any moments of joy? There must have been some, surely.
Yes, I must say it's been amazing to observe my colleagues who've been really not too keen to do stuff online, to have all of a sudden, you know, just adopted amazing practices, and to see what a little bit of pressure can do to people in changing. So we've seen a lot of amazing mindsets, a change of mindset. And so I know the pandemic is a terrible thing, but in terms of online learning, it's helped us to discover what we are capable of. So that's been very surprising and exciting to observe.
Sorry, my apologies. I think I would concur with that. I've seen a lot of that in the UK. Some colleagues have really stepped up, and it's been quite incredible. It's quite frightening for us, obviously. In the Open University, we already teach at a distance. So yeah, it's a bit of a... because the agility and the speed with which some colleagues are doing things, you know, it's quite iterative and it's quite exploratory. Hopefully that will come with a bit of self-reflection and a bit of sort of critical interrogation of it. But yeah, it's been, I would agree with that. So you mentioned that students were worried. What are the primary worries? Is it contextual worries, or is there an educational component to the worries, or is it the situations are being forced into over there, or uncertainty?
I think students, well, in our context, students who are comfortable, students who are well resourced and comfortable working from home, they are reluctant to go back to campus. But of course, we have a fair amount of students who are unable to work from home, and their biggest problem was that they were not until recently allowed to return to the residences on campus, which made me realize that we don't have an academic problem, we have a housing problem. We have students who rely on the university as a safe space to live, and actually they don't care which program they follow. They just want to go somewhere away from home where they can live and do something to keep them busy, because we've seen that in our applications. Sometimes students apply and you don't know, are they really sure what they signed up for? Did they just select architecture because it was first on the alphabet, or at the top of the alphabet? So I think our university is currently looking at ways to use the university residences for educational, you know, kind of grouping them according to programs. So you don't have an architecture student and a business school student, you know, all mixed up, so that you could even have, you know, safe spaces, because as with design, students are often required to work long hours, and then campus space, physical spaces aren't safe spaces. So I think this whole COVID situation has highlighted, of course, the unequal and, you know, inequality and all those things, but also I think opportunities to rethink education in a more holistic way. You know, is it really about the campus, or is it about more than the campus? And that'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next year or so.
I think I'll just pick up on what Nick said. That is an interesting thing. I don't know if you wanted to say any more on that, Nick, but I mean, even just approaching it from a pedagogical point of view rather than a, you know, an organizational or a spatial sort of point of view. Yeah,
absolutely.
That's slightly interesting, you know.
I think that chimes so much with what we've seen, you know, about that pedagogy. It's not all pedagogy. It's learning is not just about, you know, pedagogy curriculum, but it's much more about culture, the social involvement, the kind of non-intentional things that all the baggage that comes with it. And for us in pure distance education, it becomes so much more obvious because that's often missing or hasn't been considered, and I think that's coming through quite nicely now in a way. But of course the disadvantage is that the mixing of different disciplines does add sometimes to some you know, unintended connections or ideas or collaborations among students, which, you know, might now just get wasted in a sense. You know, it's, I mean, understandable to some degree, but yeah, you don't know, you know, if that's desirable entirely. So yeah.
in that sense, Nick, is there an extra opportunity there? Because one of the things that we always have premised at the Open University, because we're at a distance, we almost rely on students bringing their own lived and world experiences to our curriculum or our kind of content, and it's that brings it alive for them. That's where the contextualization, or part of it takes place. Some contextualization happens in the studio, but now what you've got is almost, I'm going to paraphrase maybe one of the wee projects that we're involved in, Nick, we've almost got a hyper-local sort of little mini community or connection that could potentially happen there. And
interesting. As a context of the hyper-local, we were thinking about what does it mean, you know, to have a very local learning network, not necessarily just being based on interest, but actually locality. So, you know, and if you can then create little learning networks of pure coincidence or just by physical proximity, really, but distance. So in a different way, making different connections. It's very interesting to think about. I haven't made that connection, Derek. It's interesting.
Again, it's the kind of notion, again, Sean talks about it, he paraphrases Quist, it's that notion of allowing the right sorts of learning. So you're like this garbage trawler, I suppose, this kind of educationalist who just looks for any opportunity to like let learning take place and almost like bounce it back or reflect it back.
Garbage trawler.
Yeah.
Great metaphor.
Okay, bad metaphor. My apologies.
No, I love it. Sorry.
All right, okay. Okay, sorry, everyone. Anybody else want to chip in and tell us how it's going with them?
Yeah, I'll just add on my point there, Derek, please. Sorry, my name's John Spruce. I'm from Manchester Met University. Currently in the press at the moment for all the wrong reasons in the UK. But I'll just put a point in there. Just about what we've noticed was when we started to use Teams, because obviously started the year with Teams, the students use Teams just like they would TikTok or Snapchat. And one of the unintentional kind of things that happened in like over the last 2 weeks, the students were starting chatting on it as if they were on their own social media channels, and the dynamic, which we'd never seen before. We knew it kind of existed, but we'd never been actually part of it. And actually, when it was break time, we said, okay, so we'll leave the chat now, but we'll leave obviously open so we don't have to log on and off. We went off to get a cup of tea. You come back and you go, oh, hang on, I've got to turn this off because I'm listening on conversations I don't want to hear. So but it's been really interesting that it's a totally different, almost like the personalities are totally different than they are when teacher's back in the room again, which we know has always existed, but to be confronted by it so kind of explicitly was quite interesting actually.
Definitely, and I can only recommend wholeheartedly the work of Irish academic Catherine Cronin, who studies this phenomena well across all stages of education, but particularly in primary and secondary education. And the very fact that we isolate students in early stage education from the likes of Facebook and a whole bunch of other social media, it means that we are not present as guiders of, well, not even guiders because that sounds patronistic, but you know, you're just not there to affect any kind of ethical or moral or any kind of sort of presence, if you like. So yeah, it's always something we've been aware of, I suppose, at the OU. We've always had very healthy, what we call back channels. Robust back channels.
Sometimes unhealthy too, though.
Absolutely.
You know, some rumors could be spread and it's totally out of control. That happened as well.
Yes, that's true.
But it's interesting because there was this, you know, there was the Dell conference, Digitally Engaged Learning last week, and loads of discussions around, you know, students kind of behaving in a different way, you know, being much more active online. But I really, really wonder, because at the OU, this is quite difficult to achieve sometimes. And I was wondering if those students knew each other before, or if they are new intake. John?
No, they were new, and interestingly, that level of the sort of the language that they've used and the sort of the, you know, the Snapchat text, it's kind of disappeared over the last couple of weeks. The first week, it was really evident that whoa, that's a bit odd, that the way that, you know, that's the way they're talking and the language they use and the abbreviations. I've noticed that this week it's kind of still there, but it's tailed off a lot. They've obviously clocked the fact that we can see it as well. And they've kind of reverted back to their own private channels because they didn't know each other. So perhaps they hadn't connected on social media. So that was their first sort of foray into it with each other. Now they've got to know each other a bit more. They've kind of diverted that chat into the proper social media channels, I guess. Yeah.
That's interesting, though. That, I mean, again, it's another example of almost like, automatic, I don't know, it's a horrible phrase to use, but kind of automatic human behavior. It's almost like a default need to connect. I mean, John, do you know that it maybe has translated from one medium to the other? Because that's a pretty important finding, because at least if those, because what we find at the OU is if we can make those early initial connections, it's almost like starting a fire. You get that tiny little spark, that tiny little tinder. You've got to be so careful with it, and you blow it and you blow it, and it can develop into social engagement, social comparison, and then learning communities. Do you know whether or not that translation has?
Yes, in the sense that I know that they're talking to each other on it, because because obviously, like in the first couple of weeks, you get to know a few key students, don't you, often, and you kind of rely on them, or I rely on them to kind of say, I was standing outside our 3D printers sort of tour that we had last Friday, just before we were all told to lock down again. And so I was saying, get them on the chat. Where are they? They should be here. And automatically, a couple of them were like, yeah, I'm texting them now. We're on Snapchat with each other again. And I'm thinking, great, so they have established that link there.
Well, that's really interesting. That is, yeah, that's potentially a nice route from a kind of semi-formal back to informal discussion space. It's so important in pastoral support for peer students. That's nice. Cool. Hermie, I think, did you want to have a go?
Hermie, you muted as well, I think.
Sorry, I just had a Skype call coming in the moment you said hello, Hermie, which was so weird.
That's okay. Skype and Zoom don't get on.
Thank you very much. I'm really feel honored to be here. It's the first time I'm in this space. I'm from Cape Town. And I used to teach with Yolanda at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology in architecture, and I'm now at a private university, Stadio. And I don't have students at the moment because I'm starting the architecture programs for them, so developing the curricula. So very interesting. I'm listening to conversations. In terms of a little bit of, we had Fees Must Fall for a number of years, where our students were disrupted and they couldn't come to campus. So we had to make plans to meet them online or off-site or different things like that. So in that sense, I had a bit of an experience in dealing with students not being on campus, which taught us quite a few things. But now I'm eavesdropping into places so that I can put it all back into the programs we're developing, because we're in the fortunate position now that we can actually look at our new programs and kind of try and design them from the start that they're resilient and can cope with any situation. So and I'm finding this really interesting. What I want to ask, if anybody has some input maybe on the size of groups that you find your class sizes in terms of meeting like this, where in this meeting today I can see everybody that's in the meeting quite clearly, but as soon as it's like 200 people, I've been in those, you completely lose contact. So I think this is still intimate and you can still connect with people to a certain extent, but how do you deal with it when it's like bigger classes?
Yeah, does anybody want to share what they've found? I know certainly at the OU, again, our model is, I think currently we've got about 150,000 students, but U101, our design module, I haven't checked the numbers today, but we were just about to hit 1,000 students on our stage 1 design module. There's no way that we would teach to 1,000 students, in Zoom or anything like that. Our model since the start has been a tuition model. We split that up into tutor groups of around about 20 students. And certainly my experience as a tutor is that you would usually get around about 10 students coming to a tutorial, and that's usually quite a nice, comfortable number. So it kind of scales down or scales up. It gives us a massive challenge in our studio. You know, a studio with 1,000 students is a busy thing. But even then, students almost self-organize, sometimes into groups, different kinds of groups as well. I don't know what anybody else has found though, because it'd be interesting to hear what the sort of approximate comparisons are, or Nick, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, no, just again, something I haven't thought about while the numbers are now growing exponentially, how the studio behavior will change. It's quite interesting to have a look at, actually. Thanks for prompting.
Yeah, another thing to do, I know. But no, I mean, it is a concern, because we know that when the studio gets down to about 300-ish, maybe 300 to 400, it can lose a bit of life. So that gives you an idea of the number. You know, it used to be an old sort of online content development axiom that you've got the 90 to 9 to 1 ratio. So that's 90% of people are consumers, 9% are sort of semi-contributors, might offer a like or a comment, and 1% are actually content producers. I'm not going to say it's exactly like that in some of our learning studios, but it's kind of close to those sorts of levels of engagement. So if we get too low, we know that we don't build up the momentum, if you like, of social engagement. Don't know what it's going to do with 1,000 students though, Nick. It's going to be interesting.
No, exactly. Yeah, I was wondering exactly that. Yeah, I have no idea. Let's see.
Yeah.
So at Warwick University, oh, can you hear me?
So you crack on, Robert, and then I'll go to Ken.
Okay, yeah, that's something, just something simple. So we have advised this is the central learning technology team, backed up by the university leadership, has strongly advised people not to try to teach live lectures to very large numbers online. Just don't do it. It's such a miserable experience. Academics are going to hate it. You know, talking to what seems to be an empty room, not seeing the faces, not seeing the responses. It's such a miserable experience. Just don't do it. Students won't like it. You won't like it. Avoid. So having given people that very strong direction, we're starting to see them do stuff that is interesting. So breaking down lectures into shorter segments and making it more active and organizing things in different ways. So it's forcing people to behave differently. There are, and I know many of the more traditional academics I work with are kind of jumping on this and going, yeah, we can record our lectures. And they are recording hour-long, 2-hour-long lectures for students to watch in their own time, and thinking, wow, this is fantastic. It's given me amazing flexibility. I can do this and then, you know, have the time to myself. But it's not great pedagogy. And I'm not sure we're hearing excuses now for saying, okay, so in the following year, I'm not going to show them the same videos. I've got to do it again. Because they're kind of working out, you know, slightly redundant there, having recorded the lecture once and able to show it many times in the future. So it's kind of complicated dynamics of people working out all of the parameters here and the options and trying to game it so they get the best out of it for themselves.
I think there's a potential sort of educational philosophy question in terms of content. You know, if maths hasn't really changed that much for, you know, 50,000 years. Anyway, ... Ken, did you want to?
Yeah.
Sure, go for it.
When I was listening to this, I sort of had a kind of a flashback, or maybe a couple of flashbacks. One is that the question of how many people you can have in a lecture has been going on for decades. This was one of the huge complaints back in the 1960s when I first went to university. At some universities, all the students were up in arms because they were getting these lecture halls with 400 or 500, 600 people. But at the same time, a lot of this has an enormous amount to do with economics. when I was teaching at the Norwegian School of Management, I had a course that all the people in the first year had to take. So I wound up doing a whole number of things because, of course, I'd have some lectures where everybody would be there and everybody would interact. But of course, I noticed the same problems everybody notices. So we also set up tutorials with teaching assistants. A couple of years, I got enough money together from different sources where I had associate teachers, so that we had, instead of lectures with 200 or 300 people, we had no unit bigger than 50 people. Tried a lot of different things. But one of the problems that we're facing now, of course, is the whole economics of higher education, where people are trying to push off stuff on a kind of underprivileged slave labor adjunct and part-time group. And even at my school, they tried all sorts of tricks to get me out of the first year course because they made the claim that professors were too valuable to waste on first year students. And for years, I would go in every fall and make this big philosophical and correct point that when you went to some universities, you could actually get yourself a Nobel laureate in the first year. And that's what made them great universities. But finally, they found a tricky way to grab the course from me by scheduling a meeting that they lost my invitation to, and so on. But all of this is, it's not simply the question of pedagogy. It's pedagogy, economics, what the universities are trying to do and get away with. And what's interesting about this is that you guys from OU are from just about the one of the few universities in the world that are actually thinking about this kind of distance and online situation, which therefore means you confront these questions. Ordinary universities don't. And I think the minute that, if the minute ever comes that we're safe from COVID rumbling around, we're going to see an enormous amount of questions and backlash hit the fan because of this.
No, and I know certainly that debate is kind of not raging in the UK. I don't think it's been perhaps as healthy as it could be, because not only that, we've also been one of the few universities that still operates at a functional profit, at an operational profit. And we have to be by our charter status, and we can do that by offering a degree slightly cheaper than a lot of other universities, but it's only slightly cheaper. Our production costs are astronomical for some of our courses because they are designed by massive teams to be online, to be blended, to actually, as you point out, we're in the luxurious position to actually have time to think about the pedagogical consequences of the stuff that we write. And I think what's not being realized is the consequence of, there is this attitude that you can't just commoditize that you can, because you've created a thing, that you can just take that thing and it will have the same effect in another context and another place. And, as designers, we know that that is not true. That's not how a lot of design works, or a lot of sort of artifacts work. And that translation or commoditization has happened quite a lot, I think.
Yeah. So at Warwick, we're seeing our students' union is being very firm about teaching quality. They don't want compromises, and they want us to be making sure we're doing things in the best interest of the students. That is having an effect. So there is a positive glimmer in there. I think that's a good driver for us. So I'm really happy about that.
Completely agree. And, to be having a conversation with students about pedagogy is a fantastic thing. I mean, when was the last time we properly confronted what the point of education was? Well, apart from the philosophical debates and the navel-gazing that we might do, but, when it comes down to it, and you're face to face with this object and you're asking, what is the value of this? It's quite yeah. I haven't come across that one, Ken. University of the People, have a look for that. Does anybody else want to introduce themselves or let us know what's happening from their point of view? I think we managed to get Theo.
Oh, so hello. I just feel a bit embarrassed sitting here in my trackies. I can talk as a parent as well, because my daughter's at UAL at Wimbledon School of Art, and she hasn't gone back yet, but they've been doing design obviously online. They've been having actually better tuition, they found, since they've gone into lockdown than they had. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but they weren't very impressed by the teaching in the first 2 terms. And then they went into lockdown and it actually really happened because they were having to be much more accountable for what they were doing. And so she was doing a lot more hands-on, computerized, SketchUp-y kind of work. And they would have bigger groups of about 20, and then they would go into tutorial groups of about 5 or 6. They'd submit their work, and then they'd have like little group crits, and they'd also have like a pastoral designer lecturer coming in to go through their projects with them, make sure they were okay. And so there was a kind of different kinds of education going on, the actual delivery, the physical design work, the crits, and then the pastoral. And I think that's what's going to happen when they go back. But they're going back, they're going to get a day and a half. And you think, well, they're going down hoping to get studio experience and skills and things like that, and they're not going to be able to do that, unfortunately, even at the price that they're paying. So, yeah. So as a parent, I feel quite knocked that it's not happening for my daughter, but obviously they're stuck. Can't do much else.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think Susan Orr posed an interesting question on Twitter a few weeks back, asking what the boundary, if you like, or what the, well, she was asking what the ontology, the reality of the studio is. And I think that's maybe a question that could do with being explored a wee bit here. Because I mean, we are wedded to the physical studio, and there is something special about the physical studio. Special in 2 ways. We've been having a series of debates and discussions about the nature of studio with a few people, and it is quite divisive sometimes, the negative experience and the positive experience that, you know, students can have in the studio. And I don't know, well, again, I've said this many times before, so apologies if you've heard it. I don't know that we're very good at comparing different modes of studio because we're so wedded to usually a singular view and quite a strict view of what that is, usually based on our own experience and then just reiterating that. So I think it will be interesting to explore what the boundaries of studio might be or are becoming. I don't know, is anybody playing with that at all, or experimenting, or anybody else? Yeah, John, go for it.
I don't know whether it's an experiment or not, but I've certainly tried to kind of talk to the students quite a lot, and kept in touch with a lot of our sort of returning students over the summer via Zoom, and really tried to emphasize the fact that as much as we rely on the physical studio space in uni, or we did rely on the physical space in uni, most of design business happens online and in remote studios, and with one studio connecting to another studio on different continents sometimes. And I used to work for Lego, and we did it all the time. And it's like, you were very lucky to actually be in the same physical space as anyone else, because you were all spread all over the world, feeding into Billund sort of thing. That's easy for me to say as a 45-year-old, with that like experience, but I genuinely think it's an eye-opener, and it's an eye-opener not only for students, but it's perhaps an eye-opener for staff as well, in terms of recognizing the fact that all these conversations we've been having for years about the studio and the value of studio, and actually it's a mixed diet, isn't it, that we need? And a mixed diet is probably the best way forward. Yeah. It's
interesting to say that James Carazzo, when he probed some of his tutors working at, I hope he won't mind me repeating this, at Sheffield Hallam University, when he kept pressing about having the studio barriers down so you could see everybody, so everybody can see everybody else. It turned out it was really more for monitoring who was putting what we call time on task into stuff. Again, because the reason I mention this is because my experience, well, I'm from practice as well. I was in one of the biggest architectural practices in the UK, single architectural practices, and we had massive open studio spaces, but they weren't really studio spaces. They were big open plan offices, to be quite honest with you. Studio happened in individual little clusters by project or by personality or by coincidence and other spaces. So it's almost like how do you take studio with you? How do you take that, not culture, that attitude, that thing with you that can construct studio with you, maybe, is another question. But yeah, I think it's a good point.
It's sorry, I'll just finish. It's perhaps one of the hardest things to do when you are trying to, it's almost like I find that I'm trying to get our new students, or our returning students for that matter, into the mindset of studio.
Yes.
Because they're in their bedroom
Yeah.
or on the dining table. So I'm trying to get them into the mindset of a design studio when they're physically not in it. So that's why I'm in my studio, and I've tried to make my garage appear to be a studio rather than a garage or a dining table. So when they enter this space, it is like entering the studio space, albeit remotely. Just to try and, like say, get that sense of culture, even if it's just via remote. Yeah.
Those triggers are so important. Meredith Bostwick Lorenzo, she works at Soma Architects in New York. She wrote a piece about permission spaces. That's the architecture of spaces where you go into and you know that it's giving you permission to behave in X, whatever way. And your space, with the OSB walls, it immediately gives you permission to play, to experiment. That it's okay to. I hope you don't mind, scribble on the walls or screw things to it. Maybe I've gone too far there, John. Maybe.
No, I've only been in it 2 weeks. I've not not made a mess yet.
I was going to say it looks quite nice. Actually, I can smell it from here. But these triggers do matter because we transfer these. Well, I think we transfer these concepts from one space to another.
Yeah. Interestingly, so I'd been investigating software like Miro, Mural. Yep. There's kind of like more structured, more sophisticated, shared notebook kind of visual design space, and actually found that Padlet, which is a really playful, colourful space, does the job almost as well, but gets people being playful, which is actually the hardest thing we've found, is getting them to stop overthinking, stop being too academic, and start playing with stuff. Rather than just kind of staring at a blank screen and going, what do we put here? What are we supposed to say? Just play. And Miro and Padlet's been better for that. It's primitive. It's kind of like a bit childish, but actually, I like it.
It's interesting you should say that, Robert, because this is actually going to be one of the questions I was going to ask you. Hopefully, if you do get the chance to maybe talk about what you've been doing, with your curriculum and stuff like that at some point, maybe a future session. And one of the things I was going to ask you was about the very structured nature of some of the tools that you're using, and particularly, I won't name the particular tool, but some of them are almost set up for IDEO's design thinking recipe. There you go. That's how you do design. Ting, 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 ting. There's the result. And I was going to ask you, how do you break that? But that's interesting that you've almost preempted that. It's that permission.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Well, we can have a play sometime.
No, definitely. That might be another way to do it, but rather than maybe a talk, maybe it's maybe we have a play with it.
Yeah, a bit of both.
Yeah, that could be cool.
Okay.
No,
another challenge. Sorry, preempting what I was saying, but going back to what I think has been said by a couple of people there. So our university administrators have kind of jumped on the idea that there is either synchronous activity, where the students are in a room, virtual room, all doing the same thing at the same time, often teacher-led, or there is asynchronous activity where individual students are going off and doing stuff on their own. In reality, so my background is software design and development. In that discipline, you spend your day drifting in a fluid way between working with people synchronously, working on bits asynchronously, sometimes doing multiple stuff at the same time. And that's more like being in a studio environment where you might suddenly gather together to look at a problem in a very fluid way. It's been hard to get university administrators and the kind of managerial people to understand that fluidity is the reality of work for most people.
Again, it's interesting you raised that. It was an article that we had meant to write for the Distance Design Education blog on proximity, spatiality, and temporality, because there's lots of different kinds of timings and synchronicities. So again, at the Open University, we don't say that students should be doing design from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock, but that we still give them a synchronicity of the deadline, and the deadline is another mode of synchronicity, and different people respond to deadlines in a different way. Again, one of the powers or one of the differences between our massive courses and say an open course, a MOOC, for example, is the fact that we do have these communities that all start at the same point and all have to kind of get to some end point. How they get there that's the interesting bit, but at least there's that shared semi-synchronicity. We need different words other than synchronous and asynchronous, because there are lots of different ones. And even the chunking that Yolanda, I think, mentioned earlier, you know, that can be chunky in terms of time or activity or purpose or, you know, theme. There's lots, again, different designers have different ways. So at some point, it would be good to get back to that. Maybe that's the interesting thing that will come from this whole thing, that even just the articulacy or even talking about these things might just get a whole lot better as well. Because I tell you, this stuff happens in normal studio, by the way. Sorry, does anybody else want to? Don, do you want to introduce yourself, or are you? Sorry, can I be cheeky and ask if you're teaching just now? So that's a really cheeky question. You still muted, Don? It could be another double mute. Yep, this could be the quietest that Don Norman has been for. Oh, excellent, cool. So, anyone else in the meantime? Oh, there we go.
Try again.
Yeah.
Does that work? Yeah, I've learned every so often I have to unplug the microphone and plug it back in again, and it works. I've been listening with interest. At our school, University of California, I'm in San Diego right now. We haven't started classes yet. Classes start, I think it's, what day is today? Classes start Thursday. We're on a quarter system, and so we have, you know, 3 quarters of 10 weeks each. And so we start late. We also end very late. And we did, of course, since I think about March, most of our classes have been online, but it's really been a learning experience. The one thing we did discover was that lectures, we have a lecture series every week. We call it Design at Large. We bring in some noted designer, and we require this of our students. They have to go, they get 1 credit for it, but we want them to be exposed to a wide variety of lectures. And the one thing we discovered is when we switched to Zoom, the students said, this is better, because instead of sitting in the back of a long hall where I can barely hear, where there's other people around me, I'm face to face with the speaker. And when I ask questions, and we always give preference to the students in the audience, and there might be 200 people in the audience, it's a very popular series. So they're not all required. A lot of them are just faculty and people from other departments. I feel like I'm talking to the person directly, face to face. So that was a surprise. But I think that here's why I've been involved in distance education for a long time. In fact, I think it was in the 1970s that one of my books, it was called Human Information Processing, became an Open University course. And I spent a fair amount of time with the people at OU and even went to Milton Keynes. But what was unusual about the OU, and it still is, it's actually, we heard that already the OU can spend 2 years or 3 years developing the course, and quite a considerable amount of money. And among other things, one of the important points that the OU discovered early, and I don't know if it's still true, is that, yeah, it was all distant and you studied at home and you watched the TV channel, and today it's you watch the internet and prepared stuff, but also you met periodically. People in local neighborhoods would meet with a tutor. And so that also brought a physical semblance. And I thought the combination was wonderful. And what I find today, and I've also been involved in MOOCs. I was even president of a distance education company for a while. That's a long, complex story. I won't bother you with it. What I find today is that basically everybody is struggling to learn how to do this. And the one group of people there are several groups of people who are expert at this, and they are never consulted. The OU is one of the experts in general. And there's also a field that's called learning science. And the people who are educators who really have a lot of good, important knowledge are hardly ever, they're not even known about by the general academics. And most of the research about pedagogy has been done in the K-12 arena. And we're not, we're in the higher education arena. And on top of that, we're even a more complex one because we're a studio course, which requires a different kind of instruction. Although, to be fair, that's not that much, not much different from a laboratory science, where a lot of the instruction in laboratory methods is in somewhat the same way. That it's yeah, you're told what to do and you try it, but basically you never can get it to work. And you rely upon the instructor who walks around and looks over. I mean, I remember I was a student at MIT in electrical engineering, and I would do these wonderful circuits and they would never work. And the instructor would just walk around and look at me, look at it and go stare, and then somehow wave his hands and it would work perfectly. But learning what he was doing was what was the critical thing. And that's so hard to replicate today. Because the same thing is true as we develop our prototypes and our ideas and our sketches. But we're in the beginning. But one thing I've seen a lot of is that there are pockets where what we're doing today is what we're experimenting is now perceived to be better than what we did before. And some of it's worse. And what we have to do is learn and develop a new type of education, because I believe that when this is over, and it will be, we still want to maintain some of the things we are learning. And I think that Robert put it nicely when he talked about his software design, software classes. In the real world, we go back and forth between meeting as a group and deciding upon our goals, or maybe passing on some new information and general schemes. And then we work by ourselves, or maybe we work in a small group of 2 or 3 people. And it's not surprising that the students are discovering that, yeah, I'm in the class, but what's neat is I can be using chat on the side. In fact, to be fair, Ken and I have been using chat on the side during this very meeting. And I think that actually the chats are not very good. And so that's why a lot of students are not using chat, they're using WhatsApp, or they're using whatever their favorite social media is, which actually is less disturbing. It means they can watch you while typing on their cell phone, and it actually works better. And so I think this is going to be a really interesting change in our pedagogy. And I think in the end, it'll be for the better, because when we go back to in-person classes, we can do that part, the part that works best in the traditional way, but we can now bring in new methods that we've learned about in this way. But let me just make another comment, change of topic. The reason I'm here. I am a member of the society, but I haven't been taking part in activities for the last 10 years, I guess. But I'm on a mission to try to rethink design education. And that's actually why I joined this group and been talking privately to the pedagogy group. And Ken is a part of this. And it all started when Ken and Guillermina Noel put together special issues of the journal Shed G on design education. And I wrote a chapter, a paper in that, in which I said, look, it's time to rethink design education for the 21st century. That the traditional design skills are not necessarily the ones that are absolutely needed. There's a lot of things in common with the new requirements, but today I want to solve the problems of clean water, or diseases, or education, or poverty, or homelessness. And I think designers are well equipped, because a lot of what we do in design, in finding the right problem and approaching it and treating it as a system, but with a focus on the people and experimenting, realizing that we don't always have the right answer, especially when we're dealing with people, society. So we prototype and test and modify, I think is powerful. But a lot of the emphasis in education is we're not making physical products. We are doing different. We're working with, it's really closer to service design than anything else, but it's not quite service design either. It's at a larger scale. And it's architects often who have the larger point of view, who understand how complex systems are put together. Most designers work on more on smaller self-contained projects. So how do we change design education? But I don't want to lose what we have. So what we've done is the people at the World Design Organization and also IBM Design, which now has the largest number of designers of any company in the world. They have 2,500 designers, and they're supported all the way up to the top of the organization. That is to say, the CEO, the head of the company. They decided to co-sponsor this program with us. So the Design Lab at UC San Diego and IBM Design are the primary sponsors, and we have an advisory board of 16 people, and we have 550 people across the world who have volunteered to help us. And now we're trying to piece it together and figure out how we actually come about doing this. We have studied other organizations that have done this. The computer science group is a really good one. Every 10 years, they rethink the computer science curriculum. It takes them 2 years to do it. And they're starting with a good base. So I'm assuming it's going to take us 2 or 3 years. And what we'd like to do is have a family of curricula so that if you're a traditional art-based design school, fine. And here's a set of courses that are appropriate other schools are using. And if you want to do mostly artificial intelligence, generative design courses, and you want to work on these other kinds of issues, yeah, here's a curriculum that might work. And if you want to do in this United Nations societal challenges, yeah, you need to know something about economics and politics and technology, obviously, and political science and behavioral science, especially, and so on. But underneath it all, there's a common base that makes us all designers. So that's our challenge. And that's the reason why I'm here to engage and learn. And that's why Ken is here. We have about 4 or 5 of our 16 members are members of the DRS.
Thanks for that, Don. I just wondered, actually, just when you were talking there, some of the things we've been talking about kind of started to cluster around about different shapes of education rather than actually content of education or even modes. I'll see if I can try to make that make sense, whether it is just a daft idea in my head just now. So it was when, particularly John, when you articulated it so well, that the way that we actually operate, and this was my experience in practice before I joined the Open University, it was very distributed. And we were lucky enough, we were using building information modeling software, and that allowed us to work around the world and continuously around the world through a 24-hour cycle. And it completely changed the way that studio was kind of thought of. Even just developing the skills or the aptitudes or the attitudes or whatever it is to join in that sort of practice is an exceptionally challenging thing. And that's before you even get to the starting line to be an architect or an engineer in that space. That's the thing that you bring that's of value to it. But I wonder whether there's something, Don, round about these potentially different shapes, if you like, of studio, or compositions or constitutions of studio. So for example, at the OU, we've been thinking a lot about running studios that are very different in different places, maybe third sector studios, for example, or that are comprised of design project, and that emerge round about these sort of different spaces. I wonder, is that something that's going to be either tackled or considered in what you're proposing?
Well, I can have 2 answers. One answer is yes, but that's not really the correct answer. The correct answer is what we've been doing for the past, I think it's almost a year now, is sort of getting the background and getting ourselves organized and figuring out how to run this massive operation. But we are very careful not to say what it is we're going to be looking at in detail. because what we want to do is we call it now the 550. We want to bring in a lot of these people and have them determine what from their wide, because we're only 16 people. We don't cover the wide gamut that designers do. We want to bring in other people and tell us, and we want also people from the disadvantaged nations. And there's, in fact, what's her name? Leslie Ann, who's a DRS member, has written papers about how you instruct people from the nations that don't have the kind of rich technology and educational system that we have. And there's also the problem of decolonization, of trying to move away from the European logical influence that has dominated the world and try to allow indigenous nations and indigenous cultures to come up. And then, of course, there's the new technologies and the new things that we're doing, because we're developing some powerful methods. And so what you just talked about, for example, the distributed studio, because of the new communication methods, is becoming both a virtue and a problem. So in software design, when I was at Apple, I had people all around the world. We had studios in India, we had them in Japan, we had them in England and in France and in Italy, I think it was. And trying to get these all to work together, it's a mess. And my friends at SAP who they try to do software around the world, because the time zone, there's always somebody who's in the middle, you know, and so in theory, but when you're doing software design, especially with large projects, you can have hundreds of people and it might take a couple of years to finish the project. And the most difficult part of that project is management. It's not the software, it's not the technology, it's keeping people in sync. Because in the year or two that you're doing the project, lots of people drop out, or they get promoted, or they die, or they move to a competing company. And so people are always changing, and when they leave, they take with them all the implicit knowledge. And that slows you up. Even if they're promoted, they move to a different position in the same project, but they don't no longer, the part they left has lost something. And then finally, if the conditions change, and therefore you change what you're trying to build, you modify the goals. And wow, is it hard? You modify, you just change this one piece, but it's in software, but in most things, when you change this one piece, it ripples throughout the entire organization. And in fact, it may impact something that you didn't even realize it would impact. And so trying to manage that is what's really hard. And it's made more difficult when it's people with different cultures and different time zones all across the world. That's really hard.
Yeah, no, I can completely empathize with that one, Don. I really can, from both a practice point of view and a teaching point of view. It's something we'd like to sort of experiment with.
That's one of the nice parts about teaching. We can get people from around the world together. And so students can start talking about this and learning.
But there's
John, you had your hand up. John had his hand up early. I wondered if you still remember what you wanted to say.
Oh, sorry, John. Yeah.
Thanks. This is a good moment to say that I've just been introduced by Don Norman. This is brilliant. I'm slightly starstruck. I've got Don Norman and Ken Friedman on the same call. This is brilliant. I was showing my students your videos yesterday morning, and now I'm talking to you.
Seriously, mate, honestly, you know how they were talking about the back channel chat? You want to see that.
No, what I was going to mention, sorry, was just echoed in my comment on the sidebar, that I think the value shift. So, like, traditionally, students come in and there's a set of values, and you know, preconceived sets of values about what being a designer is, or what they should value as a designer. And 10 years ago, I would have probably gone with them on that. But I've kind of got to the point now, maybe because I'm a bit older, I'm just like, no, we're going to start with what's important. You know, yes, I'll do drawing sessions with you, which I do. Yes, CAD is important. Yes, all those things are important. But if you don't understand what the bigger picture is right from day one, I need to get their thinking straight first. I need to get their awareness built of what the issues, the challenges, and where they might fit into that as a creative and a creative practitioner in the future. So I'm doing that with 18-year-olds right from day one. I'm not kind of getting their skills built and then trying to slide in bigger issues and bigger awarenesses later on in the course. I think we need to tackle it right head on when they're 18, and start from that point onwards. So yeah, absolutely agree with the seeing the challenges and exploding those challenges from day one. Yeah.
Let me make a comment. I gave a talk yesterday to IBM Design that they're having their annual meeting. And the IBM Design, as I said, 2,500 designers, and they're all around the world. So it was an interesting audience. And today I don't give talks. What I do is I give discussions, and I just answer questions for the whole period. And I find that's people really like that much better, because if I give a talk, I don't know really if that's what's of interest to the audience. And I answer questions, I know it's of interest. And one of the questions had to do with basically ethics. And we don't have an ethical, almost every major discipline, their professional society has an ethical statement, and all members are required to sign on to it. And I have not seen that in design. We also don't have a really strong society. There's no single society where sort of everybody says this is the society. In engineering, there's usually a society or a couple that are sort of known around the world. The IEEE or the ACM or whatever are fairly standard societies for electrical engineering and computer science for everybody, and they have an ethical statement. And I don't see that in design.
I wonder, is that partly because, it's like there's no ethical statement in science? There might be in different subdomains of science. So, for example, in architecture, there's a whole bunch of both ethical and professional standards, and it's by country. But design is, I don't know if anybody really has put their foot down.
Well, actually, there are ethical requirements in science. There's ethical requirements about how you do the work, and especially if you're dealing with human beings and animals, those are required. And there's all ethical issues about how you publish and how you give credit, etc. But design is somewhat different because it started off as architects and artists and so on in architecture and art schools, where that wasn't an issue, I don't think. And now we have, why isn't DRS the major design organization? Or why isn't the World Design Organization? Well, WDO, though, started off as industrial design, and that, even though they're trying to expand, anyway. But I pointed this out, that in 1971, Victor Papanek, you all probably know the famous sentence, the first sentence of his book, Design for the Real World, is basically, there's no field more dangerous in design because we build the crap that destroys the environment, both in mining the materials and second in disposing the device, et cetera, et cetera. And I argue that he's wrong. And he's wrong, not because of the point he's trying to make, but he gives too much credit to designers. And so one of the important points I tried to make to the IBM group was they don't have any say in what they've been asked to do. Because design is always in the middle. If you're in a practitioner, you have a client who tells you what to do. And if you're in a company, you have a boss or a division or someone who tells you what to do. And the only way we will have some authority about saying, no, we shouldn't do this, it's unethical, it's inappropriate, is if we get our people up to the high levels of management. There's a chief design officer at Philips. That's rare. And it's rare to have people at that high level. And that means, though, that designers, especially people who are trained from art schools, artists hate administrators and hate businesses. And that's an attitude that's often taught to the students. I've seen this over and over again. And yet, if you really want to have an influence about what is going to be made and done, you have to understand the language of business. And the business is not evil, and the language of business is not evil, and capitalism is not evil. The way it is practiced today is evil, absolutely. But let's change it. But you can't change it unless you're in a position where you can make a difference. And so that also comes back to the way we train our students. And we only have to show our students that, you know, we're in the real world. What we do in design is we make things, we do things, we change things. Therefore, we can't just do our designs. We have to understand the impact upon the world and have a say in it. And I'm pleased to say, after I gave this talk, the next person speaking was Carl Brandenburg, who's actually, he and I are the ones who are sort of doing this design education thing. And he built on that, saying how IBM is trying very hard to move you up the chain. And he even showed the org chart for designers. And there's a basic levels, they call them level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, which are different pay ranks and so on. And then above that, there are 2 tracks. One of them is the technical track. And you just become a creative designer, you become creative head, and you become moving up the creative side. The other one is the administrative track, where eventually you can move up to be, at the moment, the highest levels are vice presidents, but you can move up even above that. And we need to have more of that, especially for large companies. And I've only seen a few companies where this is permitted, SAP and Philips.
Philips is a good example, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
actually, we had a problem. We have Sean, who's the chief design officer, Philips, who's on our committee. That's the wrong person to get on our committees because we have to do a lot of work. And if you're the chief design officer, you don't have any time.
No, that's the thing. Yeah, no, definitely. That's so I'm very conscious of the time. So if anybody needs to leave, then please feel free to do so. I think we'll kind of wrap it up there a little bit. Don, what I'm going to do, I'll stick a link. Oh, I did have it a second ago. My apologies. I'll stick a link to the Future of Design Education website in the chat. I'll make sure it's in the documentation and the follow-up when we do that. So, so I think you're still calling for people to get involved individually, aren't you? Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah. So it's well worth having a look at that and the thinking to date. It's also well worth having a look at the 2 Sheji. Am I pronouncing that semi-okay there, Ken? Is that okay? Yeah, 2 special issues on design education.
Sheji.
Sheji.
Sure.
Sheji.
But I probably pronounce it badly too. So
for a long time, and nobody's bothered to pick you up, you know. Yep. So yeah, there's been 2 special issues. I'll stick the links in the shared document for that one as well. So thank you very much to everybody coming along. I know it wasn't very many people here tonight, but I think it was quite cozy. It was good to get some. It was a shame we didn't get more people from around the globe to see what's happening in the other parts of the world. I don't know whether I've made a mistake in splitting the time zones, doing a kind of Atlantic one and a Pacific one, because it maybe disconnects the community more than connects.
It was, by the way, very confusing because your view of Atlantic and Pacific, East and West,
That's
is just
true.
the opposite.
That was deliberate, yes. Because I know how much you love confusion, Don. Oh dear, right, okay. Yeah, so there's still a long way to go with the timings yet. We might recombine them, we'll see. The next one is sort of geared toward Pacific time. So that's going to be really early in the morning for people from the States. My apologies. But as I say, it will be recorded. And that is going to be an interesting one in the framework that's been developed at the University of Melbourne and the architecture school there. So please feel free to come to that one if you can. I don't think we've got anybody who has volunteered to do the next one at the kind of Atlantic time in 4 weeks' time. I was hoping that maybe Robert or Bo, that could be quite a good one for either of you, if you were going to show us some of the tech that you've been using and how you've been sort of making it work pedagogically. That'd be quite interesting to do, but I'll catch up. Brilliant, cool. I'll speak to you offline on that one, Robert. It'd be good to see what you guys are up to on that. So thank you very much for coming along. As I say, I'm going to hang around for a wee bit. If anybody did want to say anything off the record, got absolutely no problem with that. And thank you very much for your contribution, everybody, and good luck and stay safe wherever you are.